Hi, welcome to Coffee Break with Researchers. Today, we're at the Geography of Innovation conference in Stavanger in Norway, and I'm having a coffee break with Meric Gertler. He's a professor of economic geography at the University of Toronto in Canada. Coffee Break with Researchers presents you with cutting-edge insights on regional development and innovation. We ask researchers directly and in a personal manner about their work. We make scientific knowledge accessible to all. Hello, Meric. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation to a coffee break. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Same here. I want to talk with you today about the paper you wrote in which you examine the role of institutions in regional economic change. Could you please tell me what the paper was about?
So really, it's about alerting economic geographers to the fact that there are these invisible forces that shape the way we behave and the decisions that we make. And if we don't take those forces into account, then we're missing a really big part of the story in trying to explain how places develop over time.
So I see the key notion of your paper is exactly that, institutional economic geography. Could you please define it?
Sure. So institutions are rules that are either written or unwritten, formal or informal, the kinds of conventions that shape the way we behave. They're really valuable in economies because they help create predictability. For example, in certain countries we know that, people walk on the right side of the footpath versus the left side. And that widely understood rule helps people get from A to B in a very orderly way. Imagine if there was no consensus around that, the confusion and congestion that would result. And so that's a kind of metaphor for the many other institutions that shape our economic decision-making on a daily basis.
Thank you for that. And based on this notion, which ones are the main findings of your paper?
So the main findings really are four. First of all, I argue that we need to think about how institutions shape the behavior of individuals, but we also have to make sure that we leave room for the agency of individual people. So, institutions make certain outcomes more likely and other outcomes less likely, but they don't predict with 100% certainty what we will do. That's where individuals come in. The second point is that in order to have a really dynamic and full-fledged institutional geography, we have to understand how institutions change over time. And I think the best way to do that is by studying real places and appreciating how changing institutions produce changing results in those places. The third idea is that we have institutions at various different spatial scales. So there's a real geography to this. So many institutions come from the level of the nation state, the country. Such as trade rules, for example, or intellectual property rules. Other institutions are more regional or local in origin. And so we have to understand, first of all, that there are three sets, not one set. And secondly, we have to appreciate how they interact. So, for example, how do national institutions around competition make it easy or not so easy for firms in a particular place to cooperate with one another? And are there certain institutional rules at the local level that produce variations from one place to another? My point is you need to look at all of these different scales. And I guess that the next point and the final point is that the best way to understand how institutions shape economic geographies is by doing work in a comparative way. You need to compare more than one locality where there's some variation in institutional structures and use that as a way of guiding your understanding of the impact that institutions make in terms of producing economic results.
Very interesting findings. Thank you for that. So I'm very interested also in knowing what was your personal motivation in writing this paper.
Personal motivations are really two. First of all, a recognition that when you read economic theory over a long period of time, there's a lot of interest in the role that institutions play. There's a really rich literature there. And yet it didn't seem to be penetrating the field of economic geography the way I thought it should. The second motivation was that I was frustrated by the fact that people would study one case and make very sweeping conclusions on the basis of that one case without understanding how the results that they were highlighting were really dependent on the institutional architecture of that place. One of the examples is around the whole creative cities debate and the argument in the United States that cities that had a high proportion of creative employment or creative industries were inherently unequal. That, the more creative a city, the greater the income polarization. And that to me seemed like too sweeping a generalization, because I know that in the city that I work in and live in, Toronto, we have a lot of creative industries, a lot of creative workers. And there were different institutional shapes there that were actually minimizing the differences in income levels between workers of different occupations. And you can look at things like the public school system or the way that income is redistributed by governments across different parts of the region as some of the most important institutional features that produce a very different result in Canada.
Thank you for that. And finally, I want to ask you about the policy implications. Mm-hmm. So based on your research, which ones will you say are the key?
So I think the most important policy implication is that many of these institutions can be shaped by public policy, and that it's actually a kind of an optimistic finding that by crafting policies, even at the local level, that are driven by goals like reducing income inequality or accelerating the transfer of knowledge from universities to firms in the communities around them, you can actually make quite a big difference. And you can make a difference pretty quickly too. So it's actually very optimistic, and I think that's really important for policymakers to understand.
Yeah, quite indeed. Thank you. Thank you for that. So those were all my questions. Thank you again for having the time to chat with me, and hope to see you again soon.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you for watching. If you're interested in more details about this publication, find here the link below. See you next time. Bye-bye.